On December 7th, 1876, 8 strangers rode into the town of Northville, Minnesota. Shortly before noon, they stopped at a local restaurant and dined on fried eggs. Residents of Northville would later testify that the men smelled of alcohol and were clearly under the influence. After eating, the men left the diner, crossed a bridge, and headed towards the First National Bank of Northfield. They fanned out. 3 of the men entered the bank, 2 stood guard directly outside the door, and the other 3 took up positions in the nearby square. This wasn't some amateur job or some greenhorn gang of wannabes. No, this was the infamous James Younger gang, and they had been robbing and stealing and killing for years. They had perfected the art of robbing not only banks, but trains and stagecoaches as well. But on this fateful day, they picked the wrong bank in the wrong town. The citizens of Northville weren't in the mood to have their bank robbed that day. Soon a suspicious Northville resident cried out, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank." Before the James Younger crew knew it, they were being riddled with bullets, having to escape town in a hell of gunfire that resulted in the death of 2 of them and the wounding of all the others. They were shot all to hell. This kicked off a desperate manhunt that ultimately marked the end of the James Younger gang. Who were the James Younger brothers? And more importantly, who were these badass normal citizens that stood up and said, "Not fucking today"? Find out on this newest, I'm probably going to piss a lot of people off episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. What's up, y'all? Let me just say right off the bat, I wasn't real happy with my last episode that I did on the Fetterman fight. I was exhausted when I recorded, and it kind of shows. It just kind of seems real low energy and boring to me. I went ahead and released it, though, because mostly I'm just ready to move on to another topic. But now I'm on vacation, I'm fresh off an unsuccessful yet very relaxing hunting trip, and I'm ready to record again. Also, I just want to say, not sure what platform you use to listen to this podcast, but I want to share real quick all the different ways you can listen. I use Anchor.fm to launch my show, and they share it with a few different sites. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, Overcast, Radio Republic, Pocket Cast, and Stitcher. So if you have a smartphone, you can download any of those apps that I just mentioned, do a search for Bloody Beaver Podcast, and subscribe and listen that way. You can also listen directly at Anchor.fm. If you're one of those weirdos that only listens to podcasts on YouTube, and you know who you are, first question, why are you the way that you are? Just kidding. I am on YouTube, though, but it's audio only. I just upload my podcast and slap up a cool picture that has something to do with the topic I'm talking about. So yeah, just like the podcast apps, type in Bloody Beaver on YouTube and you'll find my channel. I don't get a ton of traffic on YouTube, but I'm glad I posted there because I did have one video that kind of blew up. Or what I consider blowing up, at least. A real podcast would probably laugh and disgust at my numbers, but my Brushy Bill episode has like 2,300 views on YouTube, so that's pretty cool, me at least. So who knows, maybe this episode will blow up as well. Maybe someone famous like Will Ferrell or Tom Cruise will listen and reach out. Maybe that'll result in a sponsorship. Maybe I can then afford some real professional equipment, a studio, producer to edit for me, maybe a research assistant, resulting in not only a better podcast, but more and more listeners, and more importantly, money. Lots and lots of money. Maybe then, as my ego continues to grow, I start hanging out with my new Hollywood friends a little too much. Maybe I start smoking weed with Joe Rogan. Maybe Cardi B introduces me to cocaine. And then maybe that's where the blow and pill-fueled slide downhill begins. Maybe I get more and more erratic. I stop recording altogether. Maybe then somebody will find an old tape of me singing along with a rap song when I was 14 and saying the N-word. Or something sexist. It goes viral. My sponsors leave me. My girlfriend leaves me. And my podcast gets canceled. And I'm back at square one. Just a sad clown, spending the rest of my days alone, quietly working nights at a manufacturing plant, dreaming of the good old days. Yeah, you never know. So the story at hand today is that of the Great Northfield Raid. And let's get to it. Jesse Woodson James was born on September 5th, 1847 in Clay County, Missouri, near the present-day city of Kearney. His father was a farmer and a minister, but would die when Jesse was only 3 years old. Jesse's older brother Frank was born in 1843, making him old enough to enlist when the Civil War broke out. In 1861, at the age of 18, Frank joined up with the Missouri State Guard. Young 13-year-old Jesse was probably pretty jealous when he saw Frank leave home to go fight those damn Yankees. And just to give a little historical context, Missouri was basically torn in two due to the Civil War. While a lot of southern states like Texas, where I'm from, were mostly 100% pro-Confederacy, states like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi as well, but Missouri was highly contested. It was a border state populated by both Union and Confederate sympathizers. As a matter of fact, way more Missourians served in the Union than in the Confederate Army. By the war's end, nearly 110,000 Missourians had served in the Union Army, compared to just 30,000 having fought for the South. And the Missouri State Guard that Frank signed up with wasn't actually an official part of the Confederate Army in 1861. It was basically a state militia that was formed to help protect the state from being invaded by the Union Army. They would, however, be merged into the Confederate Army of the West on March 17, 1862, but not with Frank James. He fell ill during the siege of Lexington and was left behind when the Confederate troops retreated. Frank was forced to surrender to the Union Army, swear an oath of allegiance, allowing him to be paroled. And when he recovered from his sickness, he was able to go back home. By this time, things were really heating up in Missouri. In 1863, the pro-Union Missourians had started their own home guard units, much like the Missouri State Guard we just talked about. In response to this, pro-Confederate guerrilla units started popping up, one of which was William Quantrell's Raiders, also known as Bushwhackers. And it was this unit of guerrilla fighters that Frank ended up joining, ignoring his oath of allegiance to the Union. Quantrell's Raiders would eventually launch a full-scale attack on the pro-Union town of Lawrence, Kansas, massacring some 200 innocent men and boys, and basically just looting and causing chaos. So just for context, if you've seen the movie The Outlaw Josie Wells, that group that Clint Eastwood joins up with at the beginning of the movie, the group that surrenders without Josie, that's a fictionalized version of these bushwhackers. They wore no uniforms, they weren't really officially part of the Confederate Army, and they basically are ambushed and harassed Union troops and sympathizers. If you want to see a really good representation of these raiders, check out the highly underrated movie Ride with the Devil, starring Tobey Maguire. I know, fucking Tobey Maguire, fucking Spider-Man, but trust me on this one, it's a great movie. It depicts the Lawrence Raid as well as I think accurately depicting how these young guys, basically children, teenagers, how they joined up for whatever reason with these guerrilla groups and how they slowly became numb to death and killing and they just descended into the darkness. And they would descend deep. Enter in Jesse James. He was only 16 when he joined his brother Frank in Quantrell's Bushwhackers. 16 years old. When I was 16, I was driving around town in a two-tone tan Ford station wagon with my window down, blasting punk rock as loud as my cassette player would go, and desperately and very unsuccessfully trying to find any living female that was willing to touch me. I was insecure, prone to acne, and extremely awkward around girls. I sure as hell wasn't armed to the teeth and waging a bloody insurrection against the United States government. But young Jesse was. Both Frank and Jesse would soon join up with another bushwhacker group, this one led by Bloody Bill Anderson, a man that would most definitely live up to his nickname. It was while riding with Bloody Bill that the brothers took part in the Centrilla Massacre, in which the guerrillas stopped a train carrying unarmed Union soldiers returning home from duty and killed or wounded some 22 of them, scalping and dismembering the bodies of some of the dead. They also ambushed a pursuing regiment of Major A.V.E. Johnson's Union troops, killing all who tried to surrender, who numbered more than 100. Frank later identified Jesse as the member of the band who fatally shot Major Johnson. Eventually, Bloody Bill Anderson was killed, and for whatever reason, the two brothers split up. Frank going back to Quantrell's Raiders, and Jesse going to Texas with one of Anderson's lieutenants, a man named Archie Clements. By the way, I forgot to mention, Jesse had been shot in the chest in the summer of 1864. He got shot in the chest again a second time, returning to Missouri, at the ripe old age of 17. And things would turn personal for the James brothers. Their family home was raided by Union loyalists who strung up their stepfather on a tree, just trying to get him to give up the location of the raiders, just basic harassment techniques. After the Civil War ended, the James brothers, as well as Quantrell's Raiders, kept up the fight. We talked about the reconstruction of Texas following the Civil War in the John Wesley Hardin episode. Well, Jesse would remain in unreconstructed for the remaining years of his life. Man, it's so hard not to sympathize with the James brothers. Just the idea of being a rebel, not a Confederate rebel, but I mean like the real definition of a rebel. Someone that refuses to conform or bend the knee to laws or institutions they feel are unjust has always struck a chord with me. Makes me want to paint my face blue and start wearing a kilt. Playing outlaw tunes on outlaw pipes, if you know what I mean. And there is the whole romanticized version of the James gang, being sort of a Robin Hood-like group. Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. There's that old anecdote about Jesse James robbing trains and how he would shake the hands of all the men he was robbing. Those with rough, calloused hands he wouldn't rob, just knowing they were poor farmers and working men. They said he would only steal from the rich men with soft hands, those who didn't work hard for a living. Let's take a time out real quick. If you can, I want you to pause this episode, go to YouTube, and just search Waylon Jennings and Old Reconstructed. The song's less than 2 minutes long. Give it a listen and come back to me. Cool song, huh? Gives me goosebumps when I hear it. I love to hear about an underdog that won't surrender and that can't be broken, willing to lay down their life for a cause they believe in. And for many, that's what the James brothers stood for, even to this day. Now, my roots are deep in Texas. All my ancestors who were of fighting age in the 1860s enlisted in the Confederate Army. The narrative in the South is that the Civil War was fought not over slavery, but over states' rights. Much like the American Revolution. The South didn't want the Northerners telling them how to live their lives. And I used to believe this. Many educated people in the South still do. And this is probably going to piss off a few of my listeners. But let's just face the facts. The Civil War was most definitely fought over slavery. Jefferson Davis, former U.S. Senator, Secretary of War, and President of the Confederate States of America, once said that he had frequently spoken to the United States Senate about the significance of slavery to the South and had threatened secession if what he perceived as northern threats to the institution of slavery continued. His vice president, Alexander Stephens, said that the great truth of slavery was the foundation and cornerstone of the Confederacy. The Confederate Constitution specifically provided for protection of the right to own slaves as property. Far from moving towards emancipation, the South was actually making slavery more harsh and more permanent. Once the worm started to turn against the South during the Civil War, they actually considered emancipating slaves and making them Confederate soldiers. But even facing total defeat in the face of the Union Army, they just couldn't allow themselves to arm the slaves. And is me saying this spitting in the face of my ancestry, my great whatever grandfathers who enlisted and served honorably fighting for the Confederacy? Absolutely not. Look, the wealth of the South was a result of slavery. And the rich plantation owners and politicians were more than willing to send these young poor men into combat to preserve their affluent way of life. Most of the men who fought for the South were poor and owned no slaves. Kind of the same way that if you're born in Pakistan, you're more than likely born into a Muslim family, whereas if you're a white boy like me from Texas, you were probably born into a family with a Christian belief system. If you were born in the South in the 1840s, you joined up with the rebel army. If you were from the North, you joined up with the Yanks. Most of these young men going off to fight really believed that the Union government was being oppressive. They were fighting for what they perceived to be their way of life and the protection of their family against Union invaders. Most wars are bullshit. The 9/11 terrorists were from Saudi Arabia. So why did we send troops into Iraq following the attack? Why did we give 58,000 lives in Vietnam? For what? Why do we continue to send our teenagers off to die for bullshit? These old rich motherfuckers that decide to start wars will never find a shortage of young patriotic men and women to enlist. Because politicians are bullshit artists, and young people are idealists. There's honor in enlisting and serving your country. There's honor in dying for the rights of your people. Every flag-draped coffin returning home should be honored. Every fallen American soldier, Marine, sailor, or airman should be considered heroes. Unfortunately, the sad reality is that these people that send these honorable youngsters into the carnage of war are themselves without honor, only looking out for their best interests, which usually means their bank account. So to sum up my thoughts, yeah, the Civil War was definitely fought over slavery, but most of the people doing the fighting were not slave owners. The majority of the soldiers on both sides were doing what they perceived to be their duty. Anyway, don't you just love it when I go off on a tangent? So, if you're still listening, well, I do have sympathy and respect for the poor fighting man at the South, the old reconstructed rebels and all that. I do believe they were fighting for a lost cause, and an immoral and an unjust cause. It's a damn shame that upwards of 700,000 men had to die just because some old rich dudes didn't want to give up their slaves. And I do know it's a lot more complicated than that. There was a lot at play, but this is just my simplified, bare-bones version. So, now that the war between the states is over, Jesse James will settle in Missouri and start working on the old family farm. He'd soon marry actress Sandra Bullock and discover a passion for motorcycles. His passion led him to opening up his own shop and building custom bikes, and finally landing a Discovery Channel show called Monster Garage. Wait a second, damn it, Rufus! Sorry, y'all. That was not true. I was plagiarizing the wrong Wikipedia page. No, as a matter of fact, after the war, the James brothers did return to Missouri, but just like Texas after the Civil War, Missouri was split into several factions. And Jesse and Frank's old bushwhacking partner, Archie Clements, kept the gang intact, robbing and pillaging. And Frank and Jesse may or may not have been involved in some of Archie's escapades before he was finally killed by authorities, but the brothers did rob a bank in Gatlin, Missouri in 1869. During the robbery, Jesse shot and killed the cashier, claiming it was some sort of old revenge killing from the war days. And it was also about this time that they would join forces with the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, as well as the rest of the boys involved in the Northfield raid. And all these guys had similar backgrounds as the James brothers. Cole Younger was about Frank's age and had also rode with the Quantrill Raiders, as well as taken part in the Lawrence, Kansas raid where so many innocent people were slaughtered. His younger brother Jim was about Jesse's age and didn't get involved in all that bushwhacking until 1864. He would eventually be captured by Union authorities after the ambush in which Quantrill was killed. And then you have the baby brother of the bunch, Bob Younger. He was born in 1853, so he was only between 8 and 13 during the time of the war, but he did witness his father being killed by Union loyalists, as well as his family home being burnt down. He might have missed out on all that Yankee killing, but he would join up with his brothers and the James boys in about 1873, just 3 years before the Northfield raid. The other members of the James Younger gang that were present during the raid were Charley Pitts, Bill Chadwell, and Clell Miller. Clell Miller was another child soldier, having joined up with Bloody Bill Anderson at the age of 14. Following the war, his outlaw exploits would continue. Between 1871 and 1876, Clell would rob at least 3 banks, 3 trains, 2 stagecoaches, and a general store, as well as killing 1 bank clerk, a Pinkerton detective, and a Pinkerton sympathizer. Charley Pitt's real name was actually Samuel Wells, but by the time of the raid, he frequently used his alias Charley. And that's how you alias Brushy Bill. Get out of here with your Hugo Kid and Texas Kid nicknames. Pick something low and under the radar, like Charley Pitts. Charley grew up in Missouri as well, a neighbor and childhood companion to the younger brothers. And just like the younger brothers, Charley's own father would be killed by Union sympathizers, and their house burned down as well. He and his brother did just like the Youngers and joined up with the Bushwhackers. Charley was 14 years old. Man, there was a lot of innocence lost in Missouri during the 1860s. To round out the gang, we have Bill Chadwell. He, too, was born in Missouri and is thought to have rode with Quantrell's Raiders. So none of these 8 men were wilting sunflowers. They were all very intimate with the art of killing, many of them probably having taken another man's life before they bedded a woman or were old enough to shave. And oh, how they had a deep hatred for the North. They were bitter over the war, and in some cases it was justifiable. The younger brothers, as well as Clell Miller, had their fathers killed by the Union and their homes burned down. Jesse and Frank's stepdad was tortured and their family home was bombed by Pinkerton detectives, resulting in their mother's arm being amputated and the death of their 9-year-old half-brother. So yeah, the James Younger gang most definitely had a chip on their shoulders. And between 1870 and the raid on Northfield, they were some traveling sons of bitches. Missouri, Texas, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Arkansas, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kansas. And everywhere they went, banks, trains, and stagecoaches would be robbed of their valuables. I know this episode is about the Northfield raid, so I'm trying not to go too in-depth on the James boys or the Youngers and all their exploits leading up to it. I'm just trying to give you a good feel of the gang and a little bit of their background. If you want to learn more about Jesse and Frank James, well, you're fucking in luck. There's a shit ton of books, articles, and documentaries at your disposal. There's also another podcast out there called Legends of the Old West that did a 7-episode dive into all things Jesse James. The host, Chris Wimmer, does a great job and is way more professional and polished than I'll ever be. So give them a listen. It's literally like 4 hours worth of good material, just on the James gang. And this isn't some sort of sponsored spot, by the way. I actually probably should check with him before I recommend this podcast. He may not want to be associated with my bullshit in any way, shape, or form. So just to be clear, the guys at Legends of the Old West are in no way affiliated with me. I'm just sharing their podcast because I think maybe some of y'all will find his content interesting. I think he's actually starting a several episode series on Billy the Kid as well. So yeah, now we know hopefully a little bit about the backstory, just who the James Younger gang consisted of, why and how they became stone cold killers, and why they hated Yankees. So why Northville, Minnesota? Well, just like every other topic I cover, it's debatable. We do know, however, that former Union General Albert Ames, who was also the Reconstruction-era provisional governor of Mississippi, had a mill there, and rumor has it he just dropped a substantial amount of money at the bank. And Ames is well hated among Southerners. His father-in-law, Republican Congressman Benjamin Butler, also had money in the bank. So here's their chance to get paid and thumb their noses at their hated enemies. Some sources say that the gang was in Minnesota just sort of on vacation for pleasure when they found out about the score and decided to go with it. And now let's take a break for a word from our sponsors. This episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast is brought to you by Uncle Jesse's Bushwhacker Trimmer. Listen, fellas, it's 2019. You can't be walking around anymore with your nether regions looking like the damn Amazon jungle. You gotta trim it up. And that's where Uncle Jesse's patented Bushwhacker Trimmer comes into play. Unlike most conventional modern-day hair trimmers, the Bushwhacker makes no promises that you won't get nicked or cut. And that's part of the adventure. You want to wuss out and use only so-called safe trimmers to shave your balls? Have at it. But I'm going with Bushwhackers, because like Frank and Jesse James, I like a little danger every now and then. And ladies, this product is not just for men. It's pH balanced or some shit so you can clean up your little beavers too. Maybe shave some sort of design in there. I don't know. Thanksgiving's coming up. Maybe carve a turkey on that little gobbler of yours. Maybe put a little pilgrim hat on it. Let's get creative. If you order now, Uncle Jesse will throw in, for free, the revolutionary Cousin Bob Ford's Ball Batter. A mixture of talcum powder, dried tobacco spit, strands of horsehair, gunpowder, bleach, saddle varnish, tequila, and a little bit of tangerine essential oil extract, because we're not savages. Enter in promo code BloodyBeaver at bushwhackers.com and get 20% off your first purchase. Uncle Jesse's Bushwhacker, because you never know when you might get your dick sucked. All right. I just physically felt several people stop listening. Somewhere out there, there's a distinguished older gentleman with a real passion for Old West history that somehow made it through all my other nonsense. And at the moment I uttered the phrase, dick sucked, he just threw his computer across the room. I'm sorry, man. Also, I don't know if there's really a bushwhackers.com, and I'm not going to find out. Definitely not typing that URL into my browser. So actually, do not go to bushwhackers.com. Stay safe. Okay, back to the story. I feel dirty all of a sudden. So the gang probably traveled to Minnesota via train and purchased some horses at St. Paul, Minnesota before riding to Northfield. And I did a little bit of a rundown at the beginning of the podcast. You know, the men ate breakfast before heading out to the bank and fanning out. The 3 men that actually entered into the bank were Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charley Pitts. The other 5, Bill Chadwell, Clell Miller, Cole and Jim Younger, and Jesse James remained outside. 2 standing directly at the bank's door and the other 3 in the thoroughfare. A suspicious Northfield resident by the name of J.S. Allen walked to the bank door and tried to look in. Clell Miller jerked him away, drew his pistol, and began cursing at the man. Allen ran to a nearby store sounding the alarm, allegedly yelling, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank." He hauled his ass back to his hardware store where the now alerted townspeople started gathering, and he started handing out rifles and ammunition. Around this same time, another citizen, Ansel Manning, took a concealed position down the block. A young medical student named Henry Willer ran to the hotel where he knew they stored a rifle. He grabbed it, ran upstairs, and took up a sniper's position at the window on the 3rd floor. Both Manning and Willer had clear fields of fire to the bank. And Willer didn't just grab any old rifle, by the way. No, the firearm he wielded that day was a .50 caliber Smith carbine, and Manning was armed with a Remington chambered in .45-70. Those of you familiar with these calibers are nodding your heads right now. You already know where this is going. For any listeners not familiar, these are extremely powerful rounds, both used at the time to kill buffalo. You don't just wound a man when you shoot them with a .50 or a .45-70. You kill them. I always felt like if I ever had to go to Alaska and there's a lot of grizzly bears around, I'd either want a shotgun with slugs or a nice lever-action .45-70. Point being, these 2 rifles are more suited to taking down huge animals as opposed to men, so you can imagine the deadly carnage that's about to be inflicted. A farmer named Elias Stacy grabbed a shotgun and headed toward the bank. He saw a chance to take down one of the outlaws and unloaded on Clell Miller. Unfortunately, the rifle was mistakenly loaded with birdshot. So unless you're really close, that's not a kill. Essentially, he just peppered the shit out of Miller with, I don't know about the shells they used back in those days, but nowadays a modern birdshot shell could hold anywhere between 50 or a few hundred pellets. Miller was injured, but he was definitely not out of the fight. If anything, he was now highly pissed off. My dad was actually shot in the face with birdshot once, if that tells you anything about the lethality of it. It's a shell used for exactly what the name suggests, hunting birds. I still remember when I was a kid, you could see some of the pellets still embedded under the skin of my dad's face. Every now and then one would just sort of work itself out when he washed his face or something. Anyway, a peppered and pissed the fuck off Miller starts returning fire on the farmer. But remember that young medical student with the big ass .50 cal posted up on that 3rd floor window? He took aim and laid Clell Miller into a final rest with a shot from that deadly buffalo gun. Clell was 26 years old and had spent nearly half of his life fighting. Jesse, Bill Chadwell, Cole, and Jim Younger are now trying to do crowd control. They had started off firing at the citizens, trying to scare them off, but once the citizens started firing back, things escalated quickly. The townspeople were firing from behind cover. They had the outlaws boxed in and it was a fucking shooting gallery. Basically, the town was now a battlefield. And this was before banks were insured, so these town people all had money in the bank. Hard-earned money. And they'd be damned if a bunch of bushwhackers from Missouri would just ride in and take it. The next gang member to get laid low is Bill Chadwell, who falls to Manning's powerful .45-70. Then Manning drops Bob Younger's horse and puts a round in Cole Younger's hip. Meanwhile, Jesse's out there trying to lay down cover fire, probably wondering why his brother, Charley, and Bob are taking their sweet-ass fucking time robbing the bank. At one point, Jesse was actually dead to rights, but at the same time Manning's rifle jammed, Wheeler dropped the round he was trying to reload into his single-shot rifle. Bob Younger eventually left the bank to help his pards out, targeting Manning, but Wheeler once again takes aim with that big old .50 cal, shattering Bob's arm, probably saving Manning's life. And inside the bank, Frank and Charley are unsuccessfully trying to get the bank teller Joseph Lee Haywood to open up the vault. He keeps refusing, saying that it's set on a time delay and he physically can't just open it up. Charlie Pitts took out his knife and cut Haywood's throat. Not deep enough to kill him, but enough to draw blood and probably scare the shit out of the man. And then Frank pistol whips the teller. They were determined to force the man to open up the safe. "Why won't you open up the safe?" But Haywood stood his ground. He refused. Finally, in a fit of rage and probably knowing they were already fucked, Frank levels his pistol at Haywood's head and pulls the trigger at point-blank range, murdering the innocent, yet brave, bank teller. The irony of it is, the vault wasn't on a time lock. It wasn't even locked. If Frank had just walked over there and tried to open it up, he and the gang would have been $17,000 richer, which is the equivalent of about $400,000 in today's money. They murdered that bank teller for no fucking reason, just out of spite. And speaking of killing for no reason, Cole Younger just took a bullet to his side and decides to tap the fuck out. He's done. Trying to get to a horse, he encounters an unarmed bystander. He simply aims his pistol at the man and shoots him down. Maybe it was the fog of war, I don't know. I know they were taking fire from all directions and things were pretty chaotic. But the facts are the facts. So far the gang, these so-called Robin Hoods, have murdered 2 unarmed civilians. Miraculously, the gang was able to mount up and head out of town. All they were able to get out of the bank was $26. By the way, every surviving member of the gang is now wounded. They were very well ventilated. Jesse James was the last one to get shot, taken around in his thigh as they rode out of town. All in all, the entire ordeal would last only 7 minutes. The citizens of Northfield hit up that telegraph line ASAP as possible, prompting one of the biggest manhunts in American history. Everybody and their brother were out looking for the gang. After a few days, they split up, Jesse and Frank taking a different path than the younger brothers and Bob Pitts. The latter were finally cornered in a swamp by a posse about 2 weeks after the attempted robbery, and Pitts was killed. The youngers accrued additional wounds during this fight and were arrested. Jesse and Frank were the only ones to ride to safety. The infamous James Younger gang no longer existed. But the James brothers did. They'd live under the radar for the next few years, recruiting new gang members, and just keep to their old ways. In 1879, they robbed a train in Missouri. A year later, they held up a stagecoach as well as a store in Kentucky. In 1881, they held up another train in Missouri, killing the conductor and a passenger, and yet another train again less than 2 months later. The people had had fucking enough. A huge price was placed on their heads, and finally, on April 3rd, 1882, Jesse's cousin, Bob Ford, shot him in the back of the head. He was 35 years old, 3 years younger than me. He had only known peace for a few short years before his life was engulfed with violence. About 6 months later, Frank James would finally surrender, placing his holstered pistol in the governor's hands, and he said, quote, "I have been hunted for 21 years, have literally lived in the saddle, have never known a day of perfect peace. It was one long, anxious, inexorable, eternal vigil. Governor, I haven't let another man touch my gun since 1861. And believe it or not, he didn't do much jail time. He was acquitted in 2 trials and was never extradited to Minnesota for his role in the Northfield raid. He did just a little over a year in jail and was never sent to the pen. In his later years, he held a variety of different jobs. He was a shoe salesman, sold tickets to burlesque shows, worked for AT&T, believe it or not, as a telegraph operator, picked berries, gave speeches, even joined some of the Wild West shows as an attraction. In his final days, he returned to the family farm in Missouri and gave tours of the place, and it was there that he would die on February 15th, 1918, at the age of 72. The younger brothers weren't as lucky as old Frank. Cole, Bob, and Jim Younger all pleaded to their crimes to avoid getting hung. They were then sentenced to life in prison. And Bob Younger would die in prison in 1889 of tuberculosis. He was a lunger, same thing that got Doc Holliday. Cole and Jim eventually got paroled in 1901, 15 years after their capture. Cole ended up writing a book, kind of making himself out to be some sort of a rebel avenger, and eventually joined up with Frank James on the Wild West show circuit. He died a year after Frank in 1916. Jim Cole wouldn't live that long, although he was one tough son of a bitch. When fleeing Northfield, he carried 11 bullets in his body. Some sources I read say that he had to lead his horse by the knees because the reins had been shot out of his hands. During his 2 weeks on the run, he used newspapers to bandage his wounds. When he was finally caught and took his boots off, his toenails came off with him. Not long after he was released from prison, the darkness overtook him, and he committed suicide in a motel room in St. Paul, Minnesota. You know what they say, man, crime doesn't pay. And you're probably thinking the story is over now. Nuh-uh, things are about to get weird. That young medical student, Henry Wheeler, who wielded that deadly rifle on the day of the raid, he didn't just fade into history. He actually lived another 54 years after the raid, outliving all the main participants. But that's where things kind of get weird. Being a medical student, young Henry had a need for cadavers to finish his studies. The legend goes that he asked the sheriff if he could have one of the outlaw's bodies for his use at medical school. The sheriff said that it'd be against the law for him to turn over one of the bodies to Wheeler, but that he'd see to it that the outlaws were buried in shallow graves. Supposedly, just a couple of days later, Henry Wheeler shipped a barrel by Railway Express in care of his roommate at the University of Michigan. The container was labeled pickles and smelled heavily of formaldehyde. Henry Wheeler graduated from medical school a year later in 1877. His next studies would be at the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York City. There he completed his residency. He got married in 1878 to Miss Adeline Murray of Northfield, and in 1880, his medical training finally being completed, he returned to his hometown Northfield to set up practice. Supposedly, he had the skeleton of the outlaw Bill Chadwell on display at his doctor's office. Poor Henry would marry twice, both times losing his wife's to childbirth, as well as the infants. He married a third time in 1925, and at the age of 71, he had a healthy baby boy. He'd live another 5 years before finally passing away in 1930. All in all, from what I read, he lived a very respectable life, was a kind doctor to his patients, and a very giving man. Unlike the James Younger gang, he had used his life to be a service to others. Still pretty creepy that he kept that outlaw skeleton in his office, though. Ansel Manning was given a bullet that was extracted from Cole Younger's hip, and he carried it for the rest of his life as a good luck charm. He would live another 33 years, and probably never had to pay for his own drinks in Northfield for the rest of his life. Years later, his great-great-great-grandchildren, Eli and Peyton Manning, would prove the legendary Manning grit in the sport of football, making several appearances at Super Bowls. Nah, I made that part up. As far as I know, there's no relation. I think what surprises people about this robbery gone wrong is that it took place in Minnesota, as opposed to some rough and tumble cow town. Those people were tough as nails cattlemen or frontiersmen, whereas these people in Minnesota were just city people. But here's what you got to keep in mind. If you were an able-bodied man in the 1860s and you were of age, you served in some capacity during the Civil War. I'd actually like to see a rundown on what percentage of men served as opposed to those who didn't. But just from my own readings, I'd have to say the vast majority of men served. Anyway, point being, in the town of Northfield in 1876, there's a very strong chance that nearly every man in town that day, between the ages of, say, 30 and 50, were combat veterans of the Civil War, the same bloody conflict that shaped the James Younger gang. These citizens were already bloodied. They'd already had their cherries popped. While not hardened killers with dead souls like the James Younger boys, these townspeople could handle a rifle. They knew how to fight. These outlaws simply tried to treat the wrong town. They say if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. A similar event would go down nearly 50 years later in the small town of Boley, Oklahoma. Boley was a thriving all-African-American community. Booker T. Washington once described Boley as, quote, the finest black town in the world. And in 1932, members of Pretty Boy Floyd's gang thought that the Boley Bank would be an easy target. And like the James Younger gang, who maybe they should have studied, they picked the wrong damn town. Not only did the bank employees refuse to hand over the money, but they even took up arms and killed the gang's leader. And to make matters worse, it was opening day of hunting season. The town's citizens were lined up outside with their bird guns and squirrel rifles. And like the James Younger gang, these outlaws got shot all the hell and back. The citizens of Boley, just like the citizens of Northfield, stood up and refused to be bullied by thugs. And that's always something that inspires me. Okay, that's about all I have on the Great Northville Raid and the James Younger gang. Hope I didn't screw it up too much. Now, before I end this episode, I'd like to address a recent comment. I mentioned at the beginning that I add an audio-only version of my podcast to YouTube. I did get a negative comment, which I normally wouldn't address at all, but I think it's an important one, and it's in reference to my Quanah Parker episode, and more specifically, my potty mouth. The commenter says, quote, I have to say I have stopped listening because of your unnecessary cursing. It is disrespectful and in no way helps you tell the story. In fact, it distracts away from the storytelling. Not any good to have the child who is listening along continuously ask, why does he keep swearing? Honestly, I had no good answer, except to say maybe he doesn't know better. This person left an additional comment that said, quote, by the way, Cynthia Ann is my distant cousin, end quote. Cynthia Ann, of course, being Quanah Parker's mother. So I'll admit, my initial reaction was to reply with sarcasm. But I decided not to. I really want to honestly address this comment politely and with an open mind. I can only assume you did a search for Quanah Parker and thought you were putting on an educational video for your kid or maybe grandkid to teach them about their heritage, which is cool, only to then have them hear me cussing up a storm. All of the episodes of my podcast are labeled as explicit. I do that, not Anchor, who I publish through, not iTunes, me. I personally make sure that tag is on there as sort of a warning. And when I recommend my podcast to people, I always give them a heads up that it contains not safe for work language. YouTube was just an extra thing I did to promote my podcast. I'm not a YouTuber. I just decided to slap my episodes on there, hoping for a little bit of extra exposure. Unfortunately, I did fail to add any disclaimers to my YouTube channel about profanity, or graphic content, or whatever you want to call it. And to be honest, I'm not even sure how you add that explicit tag to the videos. I'm trying to figure that out. In the meantime, I have gone back and left a warning in my video descriptions. I do not apologize for my language, but I do regret not adding some sort of warning. So that said, I'm not a character actor. What you hear on my podcast is pretty much me and the way I talk. The only exception being that I'm a pretty private, introverted person in real life. So this is how I talk around my closest of closest friends. In strange company or big groups, I'm actually a pretty quiet guy. Also, I want to make a podcast the way I want to make one. I don't get paid to do this, and as such, I don't have a boss. I don't have to answer to anybody, except maybe my girlfriend, okay? So I decided to record this podcast as if I'm just having a few drinks with friends and telling a story. Also, I do talk about Wild West era topics. This was an extremely brutal part of American history. I use the word atrocities a lot on this podcast. There were a lot of atrocities talked about on the Quanah Parker episode. Things like gang rape, murder, the killing of women and children, Comanche babies being carved out of their mothers' wombs by American soldiers, captive white children being killed and mutilated by the Comanche. All of these things are historically documented. You can find them in history books. I don't think you can gloss over this stuff when it comes to a topic like Quanah Parker. You know, this ain't no Disney movie. If you want to discuss how he came to be who he was, you have to address the violence committed by both white settlers, the American government, and the Comanche people. So I do find it odd that it's okay for a child to hear about such horrendous acts, to have them published in history books, but it's not okay for me to drop an F-bomb when I'm talking about the same acts. And I don't know if you meant my language was just disrespectful in general, or disrespectful to Quanah Parker and his descendants, or just all of the above. I wonder if Quanah Parker used only respectful language when he raided and killed and slaughtered. I wonder if U.S. soldiers who participated in the Sand Creek Massacre, which I discussed on that episode, only used polite church-going language when slaughtering all those women and children in cold blood. You also ask if I know better. Yeah, I think I do. I don't use profanity around children. I raised a 19-year-old that has rarely heard me curse. And I also know fully well the way I talk is a detriment to gaining greater exposure. I joked earlier in this episode about finding sponsors and making money. That's not going to happen. Don't get me wrong, it would be awesome. I'd love to do this for a living. But let's be honest. The Wild West podcast fan demographic is extremely tiny and mostly consists of older white guys who probably lean conservative. And they probably don't want to hear my stupid jokes or my profanity. But I'm not doing this for the money. This is just a fun, creative outlet for me. So while I appreciate your comment, I will keep talking the way I talk. This podcast isn't being forced on anybody. You can listen to it or not. I actually hope you do go back as a cousin of Cynthia Ann Parker and finish the episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as a whole, if you can make it past my potty mouth. I do talk a lot about what I consider interesting themes on that episode. And please feel free, all of you, to email me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com with any thoughts on this episode, or any episode, or my voice, or how stupid my face looks, or how dumb you think my feet are, or maybe, I don't know, I got a weird nipple. I don't know. You email me, I'll respond. Okay, y'all, that's all I got this week. Don't be stupid and rob a bank. Definitely don't kill any bank clerks. If you do shave your pubic hair into some sort of Thanksgiving theme, do not send me a picture. And above all else, don't start a civil war. Come on.